Welcome back to another episode of the CSKA podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this week's episode, I am unpacking some scholarship. In particular, I'm reading Chapter 2 from the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. If you haven't listened to the Unpacking Scholarship episode from 2 weeks ago, which talks about Chapter 1, I highly recommend starting there first. And the reason why is because Chapter 2 builds off of the discussions on oppressors and the oppressed that were introduced in Chapter 1. In Chapter 2, however, which I'm going to chat about today, we're going to talk more about, what does oppression look like in education and what can teachers actually do about it? So in particular, this chapter is going to introduce one of the more famous concepts that came out of this book, which is the banking concept of education. So to give you a taste of what this chapter is all about, here is a quote from page 65. These are some of the sentences from the opening paragraphs of this particular chapter. Quote, "A careful analysis of the teacher-student relationship at any level, inside or outside the school, reveals its fundamentally narrative character. This relationship involves a narrating subject, the teacher, and patient listening objects, the students. The contents, whether values or empirical dimensions of reality, tend in the process of being narrated to become lifeless and petrified. Education is suffering from narration sickness. The teacher talks about reality as if it were motionless, static, compartmentalized, and predictable. Or else he expounds on a topic completely alien to the existential experience of the students. His task is to fill the students with the contents of his narration. Contents which are detached from reality, disconnected from the totality that engendered them and could give them significance. Words are emptied of their concreteness and become a hollow, alienated, and alienating verbosity." End quote. All right, so this kind of outlines the main point of this particular chapter. So Freire is basically arguing what many of the guests and myself have argued on this podcast, in that education can be decontextualized from what kids actually want to learn and things that are relevant to them and in their lives. And this can give it this lifeless feel and makes it so that it comes across as the teacher is filling the students with irrelevant information. So let's explore this a little bit more in the chapter. So Freire argues this turns students into containers or receptacles that are passively being filled with decontextualized information by the narrator or teacher. This approach, quote, "attempts to control thinking and action, leads to women and men to adjust to the world, and inhibits their creative power," end quote. It's from page 71. This idea of narrating to students and students being the passive listeners is an approach that Freire refers to as a banking system of education, where teachers are basically depositing information to students who are the passive recipients of knowledge. So here's a quote from page 66 that kind of unpacks that a little bit more. Quote, "In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. Projecting an absolute ignorance onto others, a characteristic of the ideology of oppression, negates education and knowledge as processes of inquiry. The teacher presents himself to his students as their necessary opposite. By considering their ignorance absolute, he justifies his own existence. The students, alienated like the slave in the Hegelian dialectic, accept their ignorance as justifying the teacher's existence. But, unlike the slave, they never discover that they educate the teacher." End quote. So in other words, building off of the stuff that was discussed 2 weeks ago from Chapter 1, the teacher is essentially acting as an oppressor, and the student is the person who's being oppressed, because there's an assumption that the students know nothing, and that is the teacher's job to teach them everything. So Freire suggests a liberatory approach to education actually involves acknowledging that the juxtaposition of student and teacher is false, as students can be teachers, and teachers can be students. As myself and many of the guests on the show have iterated, you learn a lot from working with kids. They can teach you some really awesome things that you may have never even considered or known about. And obviously the inverse is also true. Kids can learn a lot from you. So we need to acknowledge that that relationship exists and that both parties can learn from each other. This is one of the reasons why I mentioned in previous episodes that I prefer to call myself a facilitator or somebody who facilitates. So I design and facilitate educational experiences, and I help kids learn in those processes. However, I am also learning alongside them, and we are co-constructing the learning environment together. We'll talk about that a little bit more in this episode and the episode 2 weeks from now. Okay, so you might be wondering, how is banking a form of oppression? So Freire suggests that, quote, the more completely students accept the passive role imposed on them, the more they tend simply to adapt to the world as it is and to the fragmented view of reality deposited in them, end quote, from page 67, and I modified the word they to students. If we tie it back to what was discussed 2 weeks ago in chapter 1, if oppressors actually encouraged critical thinking and transformation by the people they are oppressing, this would likely result in a shift in power or a shift in a socially constructed way of being that is designed to serve the oppressors. In other words, by not teaching kids how to do critical thinking and how to transform their current situations, teachers can perpetuate a form of oppression where students are unquestioning their position as the unknowing and the teacher as the person who knows. Now again, tying back to the episode 2 weeks ago on chapter 1, the oppressors use language such as welfare recipient or incompetent and lazy to describe people who are participating in a program that is designed to make people want to integrate or be incorporated into what is considered a, quote, healthy society. However, this healthy society is actually one that continues to maintain this power imbalance. So in other words, oppressors view those who are oppressed as lesser than unless they are striving towards becoming a fellow oppressor, or simply somebody who follows the rules that were set in place by the oppressor and only work toward the advantage of those who are oppressing others. Tying this back into the classroom, we can say that certain ways of being a student are considered to be the appropriate ways of being a student, while others are not. As I mentioned 2 weeks ago, some examples might include not questioning the teacher, not being able to propose your own assessment or your own demonstration of understanding through a project that you choose, or even as a teacher who is oppressed by administrators or standards or state policies or whatever, not being able to teach units or lessons on subjects that are interesting to you and the kids that you work with within a given broader topic such as computer science. These are all forms of oppression, and the language that is used to oppress people often positions people who are not behaving as designed in a negative light, and the people who are following the rules, essentially, are positioned positively. This makes it so that students try and integrate into what is considered to be the appropriate ways of behaving, as well as teachers to integrate into what are considered to be the appropriate ways of being an educator. Okay, so if we go with the notion that teaching can be a form of oppression, especially in this banking form of teaching that Freire is mentioning, what can educators do about this to prevent this? So Freire suggests liberatory educators can actually focus on trusting students and their creative powers through a partnership between students and teachers rather than a domestication of students. And this is where Freire introduces an idea of a teacher-student with a hyphen in between and a student-teacher with a hyphen in between. That phrasing of a teacher-student is basically what I refer to as a facilitator. So somebody who takes on the role of trusting students and encouraging creativity and learning alongside and from students, rather than trying to domesticate them into some way of thinking or knowing a particular topic or subject like computer science. Another way that we could describe this is epistemological colonization. In other words, we are taking over the ways of thinking and knowing that students value and supplanting our own. Again, all of this likely occurring unconsciously by educators. Now, interestingly, Freire suggests that people who are educated through a banking approach are actually well suited to perpetuate the systems of oppression that were likely unknowingly oppressing the person being educated. So here's a quote from page 70. Quote, "The educated individual is the adapted person, because she or he is better fit for the world. Translated into practice, this concept is well suited to the purposes of the oppressors, whose tranquility rests on how well people fit the world the oppressors have created, and how little they question it." End quote. So in other words, if you, like myself, have advanced degrees in education, you likely have gone through many years of a banking approach that rewards certain ways of being a student and punishes others. Same thing for being a teacher, community member, etc. Although subtle, these are all technically signs of oppression that influence the way that you teach and what you think of as quality education. And when I say you, I also include me within that. The ways that I facilitate and the things that I talk about on this podcast are certainly influenced by other individuals, such as Freire and other authors that I've already talked about, and other theoretical frameworks in education that I may have not even been aware of that were influencing me, and the things that I was reading or experiencing, etc. However, that being said, educators who are actually interested in helping liberate students from some of these forms of control need to do so in a way that is not another form of banking of liberatory practices. In other words, we need to make sure that we don't just say, hey, here's a problem, I'm going to teach you what the problem is and how you're going to fix it, which would assume that students can't come up with a solution on their own. So here's a quote from page 72. Quote, "Authentic liberation, the process of humanization, is not another deposit to be made in men. Liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of men and women upon the world in order to transform it. Those truly committed to the cause of liberation can accept neither the mechanistic concept of consciousness as an empty vessel to be filled, nor the use of banking methods of domination, propaganda, slogans, deposits, in the name of liberation." End quote. And to add on that, here's a quote from page 72 to 73, and modify the first word. Quote, "Educators must abandon the educational goal of deposit making and replace it with the posing of the problems of human beings in their relationship with the world." End quote. In other words, rather than taking an approach of, I'm going to teach you all the information, skills, concepts, practices, etc., because you don't know anything, instead going with a problem-based approach where you pose a problem and students will work through that problem with some guidance or on their own, or in small groups, whatever. So by adopting this kind of an approach, or these kinds of practices, quote, a new term emerges. Teacher-student with student-teachers. The teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is himself taught in dialogue with students, who in turn, while being taught, also teach. They become jointly responsible for a process in which all grow, end quote, from page 73. So by taking this approach, you get that hyphenated set of words, the teacher-student and the student-teacher. Everybody is basically learning from each other. And again, I prefer the word facilitator rather than teacher-student. So some suggestions that Freire provides in terms of how to pose problems as a teacher-student are, quote, "The problem-posing educator constantly reforms his reflections in the reflection of the students. The students, no longer docile listeners, are now critical co-investigators in dialogue with the teacher. The teacher presents the material to the students for their consideration and reconsiders for earlier considerations as the students express their own. The role of the problem-solving educator is to create, together with the students, the conditions under which knowledge at the level of the doxa is superseded by true knowledge at the level of logos." End quote, from page 74. So in other words, this is different than problem-based learning where there's one right answer and you know the answer in advance. Instead, it's about posing a problem, like a wicked problem, as has been described elsewhere, or a real-world problem with many solutions, and having students critically reflect on it and work through some kind of a solution that will result in an action or transformation by the students. Here's a quote from page 76. Quote, "In problem-posing education, people develop their power to perceive critically the way they exist in the world with which and in which they find themselves. They come to see the world not as a static reality, but as a reality in process, in transformation." So this approach drastically differs from what Freire refers to as the banking approach. So here's a comparison of the two, and this is a quote from pages 76 through 77. Quote, "Banking education, for obvious reasons, attempts, by mythicizing reality, to conceal certain facts which explain the way human beings exist in the world. Problem-posing education sets itself the task of demythologizing. Banking education resists dialogue. Problem-posing education regards dialogue as indispensable to the act of cognition, which unveils reality. Banking education treats students as objects of assistance. Problem-posing education makes them critical thinkers. Banking education inhibits creativity and domesticates, although it cannot completely destroy, the intentionality of consciousness by isolating consciousness from the world, thereby denying people their ontological and historical vocation of becoming more fully human. Problem-posing education bases itself on creativity and stimulates true reflection and action upon reality, thereby responding to the vocation of persons as beings who are authentic only when engaged in inquiry and creative transformation. In sum, banking theory and practice, as immobilized and fixated forces, fail to acknowledge men and women as historical beings. Problem-posing theory and practice make the people's historicity as their starting point. Problem-posing education affirms men and women as being in the process of becoming, as unfinished, uncompleted beings in and with a likewise unfinished reality. End quote. So here's a quick summary that compares the two approaches. So banking education is creating a false reality, whereas problem-posing education is looking at trying to deconstruct that false reality. Banking education does not engage in dialogue, while problem-based education really is all about dialogue, which we'll learn more about in the episode 2 weeks from now on Chapter 3. Banking education treats students as passive, whereas problem-posing education focuses on critical thinking. Banking education prevents creativity, while problem-posing education focuses on creativity. And banking education does not take into account some of the contexts and hegemonic influences or social pressures that are influencing kids and adults. Whereas problem-posing education really focuses on the humanization that can occur through education. Which, by the way, Freire reminds us, the readers, that the goal of education should be humanization. Therefore, we should not strive to flip the roles of oppressor and oppressed, but should instead focus on humanizing everyone through fellowship and solidarity. So in other words, if you're in a CS education class, the goal is to not make it so that suddenly the students are in charge and the teacher now has to listen to and report to the students, but instead trying to make it more horizontal in terms of the hierarchical structure. The students and teachers working in collaboration with each other and learning from each other. Which again, many of the previous interviews and unpacking scholarship episodes talk about that. Okay, so as always, I like to talk about some lingering thoughts or questions that I have whenever I unpack any form of scholarship for this podcast. So the first thing that I want to point out is that I actually disagree with Freire's assertion that all teaching is positioning students as passive recipients. So, for example, statements such as this quote from page 67, quote, "The teacher knows everything and the students know nothing," end quote. And here's another one from the same page, quote, "The teacher thinks and the students are thought about," end quote. So those quotes are very broad statements without any evidence to support those claims. So while I understand what the author's intent is, I disagree. I don't think I'm aware of any teaching where it is 100% in that category. And although it makes a point, I think this creates a false binary about teachers and students that I just really don't think exists, at least to this extent. So a question that I have is, in what ways do CS educators unintentionally fluctuate between a banking approach and a liberatory approach to CS education? So as I've mentioned in other episodes, Freire has heavily influenced my own facilitating and education practices, as well as many of the people that I've read and studied with. However, I still unintentionally fall into forms of banking approaches at times. And so just kind of thinking out loud on that, I wonder where we as a field or as individuals within a field also kind of unintentionally fluctuate between the banking approach and the liberatory approach to CS education. So the question that I have then for the field is, how can we as a profession focus more on liberatory practices? How can we become more aware of when we are unintentionally fluctuating back towards a banking approach? So for example, in conferences, how can we better identify which sessions are promoting more of a banking approach, which sessions are promoting more of a liberatory approach, and how can we facilitate a dialogue between these different approaches? Now, another more meta question that I have is, when is Freire's book and my podcast episodes on each chapter a form of banking, and when is it a form of liberation through critical thinking? I'd like to think that by voicing out loud my critical questions and thoughts at the end of each one of the unpacking scholarship episodes that I do, I like to think of this as a way of me thinking publicly and engaging in critical reflection practices and kind of modeling some of the practices that Freire discussed in this particular chapter. However, I can also see how some people might argue that this is yet another form of banking. And if you feel that way, let me know. There's a contact me button on my website. You can also come on the podcast, and I'm happy to chat about this. I sincerely want to know, in what ways can we, as a profession, try and move away from the banking approach to education that Freire describes and move more towards the facilitation and liberatory practices that has been discussed on this podcast, which is why I tend to discuss it a lot with guests and in the Unpacking Scholarship episodes. All right, so that kind of concludes the summary of Chapter 2. Now, again, as usual, next week is going to be an interview, and 2 weeks from now, I'm going to unpack Chapter 3 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and then 2 weeks after that, I will conclude this little mini-series with a discussion on Chapter 4, which is the final chapter in the book. I hope you are enjoying the first half of this Unpacking Scholarship mini-series, and I hope you stay tuned next week for another awesome interview. Hope you all have a wonderful week and are staying safe. Thanks for listening.